This is your Armchair Detective, and today I'd like to tell you about the case of the weekend murder. George Francis Washington insisted he'd left his wife alive and well on Friday night when he went to spend the weekend on his yacht. And with a name like George Washington, he'd hardly lie, would he? Or would he? Besides, he'd briefly chatted with a neighbor as he left, and no doubt she'd remember, he said. Mr. Washington went on to say that he'd returned on Sunday night to find his wife lying dead on the floor, apparently having stumbled over the rug and hit her head on the hearth curb. When he'd made certain his wife was dead, he immediately phoned the police. And that's how Inspector Johnny Lee and Dr. Cobb happened to be present now. Lee eyed Washington and wondered. Rumor had it that he'd been spending his money freely on a young and beautiful model, and that his wife voiced frequent and strenuous objections to his romantic roistering. Lee looked round the room, noted the table set for a simple meal, the small kerosene stove burning brightly. Dr. Cobb had now completed his examination of Mrs. Washington's body, and Inspector Lee looked at him inquiringly. Her skull's been fractured, and yes, it could have been caused by a head striking the fireplace curb. I'm afraid I can't give you the exact time of death, but it must have been at least 24 hours ago, said the doctor in a terse summary. Inspector Lee should have been satisfied, but somehow he wasn't. Then he noticed the fire had gone out. Dr. Cobb, impatient to be gone, said acidly, "Surely you don't think there's anything suspicious here?" "I certainly do," Lee retorted promptly. "It was very cleverly done, and it fooled you just as it very nearly fooled me. But I assure you, my dear Cobb, that this was no accident. Mrs. Washington was murdered." Now, what made Inspector Lee say that? The small, quick-burning kerosene stove gave Inspector Lee his clue. It was burning brightly when he arrived, yet a little later it was burnt out. Dr. Cobb had been unable to pinpoint the time of Mrs. Washington's death accurately, but he had been able to say she'd been dead at least 24 hours. This meant someone had relit the stove since her death, yet she was supposed to have been alone. The obvious suspect was her husband, who said he'd been away for the weekend. Inspector Lee intensified his inquiries, and, ironically, the same neighbor who confirmed Washington's story of leaving on the Friday night had seen him sneaking in again on the Saturday. He'd relit the kerosene stove, hoping to mislead police about the time of death by keeping the body warm and retarding rigor mortis. His plan failed because of the keen mind of Inspector Lee, and George Francis Washington kept an appointment with the public hangman on March the 3rd, 1958. And just in case you've been worrying about it, you'll be relieved to know he wasn't even a distant relative of his famous, illustrious namesake.